After February 24, 2022, Turkey became the focus of attention for Ukrainians. It is Turkey that controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, which connect the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Thanks to the Montreux Convention of 1936, Ankara has the right to close them to military ships, which is exactly what it did after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, essentially holding the keys to our sea. At first glance, this is a model regional power, with a population of over 85 million, the fourth largest army in NATO, and a GDP of over $1 trillion, which is 3 times higher than the combined figures of all other EU membership candidates. It has advanced healthcare, with more than 50 clinics certified by JCI, the global gold standard for medical accreditation. Istanbul is among the top 20 tourist destinations in the world, and in 2025, the Turkish defense industry alone exported weapons worth more than $10 billion. According to the Global Soft Power Index, which is compiled annually by the British consulting company Brand Finance, it evaluates how a country is perceived in the world based on 6 parameters, from international reputation to technological and cultural influence. The country ranked 25th out of 193 countries ahead of New Zealand, Portugal, and Ireland. Turkey has another strong foundation. It sits on 72% of the world's boron reserves, stands at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and has an industrial base that accounts for about 20% of the economy. 97% of its population is educated, and it has a talent pool that half the region dreams of. Despite these advantages, the country remains import-dependent in energy, with domestic production covering only a quarter of its needs. Although Turkey does not look like a laggard, its EU candidate status, which it has held for over a quarter of a century since 1999, has become more of a red light than a sign of progress. No other country has held this status for so long. For comparison, the accession process for Poland and Croatia took 10 years. Bulgaria and Romania needed a little more time, and for Ukraine, according to analysts, this path may take from 5 to 10 years. So why has Turkey not been able to move forward and become a full member of the EU for 3 decades now? Because its political system and the rule of law do not meet the EU's criteria. The European Union requires independent courts, minority rights, fair competition, and stable democratic institutions. Turkey, however, is moving in the opposite direction. The concentration of power, persecution of the opposition, and restrictions on freedom of speech have placed it 159th out of 180 countries in the Press Freedom Index. Worse than Ukraine during the war. The country has significant corruption risks, and conflicts with certain countries are freezing the accession process. Formally, the doors to the EU are not closed, but political reality makes them almost out of reach. A state that in 100 years has not overcome its dependence on a strong leader. Moreover, the country constantly faces shadow economic imbalances. Only in the last 3 decades has it gone through a series of large-scale upheavals. Currency and debt crises of 1994 and 2001. Constant volatility in the 2000s and a new currency storm in 2018, the consequences of which Turkey still feels today. The lira has become one of the most unstable currencies in the region. Its decline has become a symbol of Turkey's deep economic problems. The national currency has depreciated more than 23 times over 2 decades. What cost 100 lira in 2004 now costs 2,300. According to the Fragile States Index, which shows how resilient a country is to internal shocks and crises, it stands alongside North Korea. So why? Instead of a leap into the European club, Turkey got inflation swings, political distortions, and capital flight. And what warning should this be for Ukraine, which must follow the path to full membership in the European Union? Modern Turkey emerged from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lasting states in world history. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans controlled territory from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, from Cairo to Budapest. In the 18th century, the empire began to fall apart. not by the sword, but by its own inertia. Corruption, favoritism, and ineffective governance were eating away at the state from within, while chronic inflation destroyed trust in it. Ottoman sultans often reissued coins, reducing the silver or gold content to cover military expenses. As the Turkish economist Şevket Pamuk points out, each such monetary reform only accelerated the collapse of prices. The price revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was especially devastating. When, due to the influx of American silver, prices in the empire rose by more than 500%, people lost trust in the coin. Merchants began to demand gold or foreign currency. Peasants hid their grain. Craftsmen switched to barter. The empire, which once thrived on global trade, began to suffocate in its own financial flaws. Defeat in the First World War became the final blow. Under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, the Allies effectively dismembered the Ottoman Empire. Western Anatolia was to go to Greece, the south to Italy and France, and the northeast to Armenia. It seemed that Turkish statehood would disappear forever. But an officer appeared who changed the course of history, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He didn't just create a new country, he created it anew. In just a few years of the Turkish War of Independence, he not only drove out the Western forces, but also built a new model of the state. Secular, national, rational. In 1923, the Turkish Republic was established, and the Sultanate and Caliphate were abolished. When Mustafa Atatürk came to power, the country was on the verge of chaos. The collapse of the empire left millions without jobs, and the monetary system was so unstable that people stopped seeing money as a reliable means of payment. He promised to build a nation from the ashes of the old order, and relied on the state as the main investor, reformer, and arbiter. It was at that time that the model which would define Turkey for decades was born. Centralized power, a state-run economy, and faith in strongman rule. Kemal's reforms were among the most radical reforms of the 20th century. The Latin alphabet was introduced instead of the Arabic one. Equal rights were granted to women earlier than in most European countries. New civil codes were adopted based on the Swiss model. Secular education was introduced, and a unified state school system was established. In the 1930s, the state nationalized banks, railways, and large enterprises, and created state companies in key sectors from textiles to chemicals. In 1934, 5-year plans inspired by the Soviet model came into effect, but with room for private business. Private entrepreneurs could operate in areas that were not considered strategic, particularly in trade, the agricultural sector, and small-scale industry. The state, on the other hand, controlled heavy industry, banks, and infrastructure. This created a mixed model where private initiatives coexisted with large state enterprises. The result, between 1923 and 1939, heavy industrial production increased by 50%, and GDP per capita rose from $800 to about $2,000. Turkey became a stable industrial state, but with a centralized economy, vulnerable to external shocks. The model established by Atatürk involved almost complete state control over the economy, which made it a hostage to political decisions. For many decades, the Turkish military considered themselves the watchdog of the state, the ones who had to ensure that the country remained secular and that politicians did not destroy the system. When, in the military's opinion, the government went too far or deviated from Atatürk's principles, or when the country descended into chaos, the army would take power into its own hands. This happened 4 times. In 1960, in 1971, in 1980, and in 1997. So for a long time, it was the military that was the final authority in the Turkish political and economic system. We thank all the donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every hryvnia you give brings economic prosperity and well-being closer to Ukraine, because we are not just working, we are developing. And we enlighten voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The support link is in the description. Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might have been watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell your family and friends about it. Also, give us a like and leave a comment under this video. After World War II, Turkey made a strategic choice to the West. In 1952, it joined NATO, becoming the eastern shield of the alliance against the USSR. That's why they also gained access to big money, aid, loans, and technical support under the Marshall Plan. Turkey received $320 million in aid, about $2.5 million in technical support, and $30 million in loans through the European Payments Union. This was a post-war settlement system between European countries, created to facilitate trade and economic recovery so that states could settle accounts with each other. American money became the impetus that changed the country's economy. They gave Turkey the opportunity to mechanize agriculture, build infrastructure, and transition to a more modern economic model. Thus, the funding became a catalyst for the agricultural revolution. By 1951, 14,000 new tractors had been brought into the country. Farmers received modern equipment, agronomists, and training courses. Wheat production increased so much that by 1951, Turkey had a surplus of 800,000 tons, of which 300,000 tons were exported. Cotton increased from 58,000 tons in 1948 to over 150,000 tons in 1951. The country even became one of the leading grain exporters in Europe. The economy seemed to be on the rise, but the foundation for this miracle was shaky. By the mid-1950s, rapid lending and excessive government spending led to external debt, which grew from $600 million in 1953 to over $1 billion in 1959, and the devaluation of the lira from 2.8 to 9 lira per dollar. This was facilitated by the policy of the Democratic Party, led by Adnan Menderes, once a symbol of reform, later a symbol of authoritarian rule, restricting the press, pressuring universities, and persecuting the opposition. Prime Minister Adnan Menderes, he promised grain and roads for everyone. In addition, his government was associated with economic liberalization, expanding the role of the private sector, active electrification, which relied on the influx of foreign aid and the growth of agricultural exports. But when debts began to rise and inflation got out of control, the government responded not by correcting the growth model, but by tightening political control, in an attempt to suppress the resurgence of its main rival. A parliamentary investigative committee was created in Parliament that could shut down newspapers, persecute the opposition, and became known for pressuring universities and restricting rallies. In May 1960, the army's patience ran out. The military, who considered themselves the heirs of Ataturk, overthrew Menderes, returning Turkey to the cycle of reform, chaos, and coup. The immediate catalysts of the coup. The coup was triggered by a combination of economic crisis, inflation, the 1958 devaluation, accumulated foreign debts, and political repression, including restrictions on press freedom, bans on opposition rallies, and clashes during student protests in Istanbul and Ankara in the spring of 1960. This coup was the first in a long series, serving as a warning that democracy without economic stability in Turkey is always fragile. It opened a new era when the army would become the shadow arbiter of politics, and the economy a hostage to the cycle between reforms and crises. In the 1970s, Turkey faced a global economic shock due to the OPEC oil embargo of 1973. After the Yom Kippur War, Arab exporters sharply restricted oil supplies to Western countries, and prices skyrocketed. The price of a barrel rose from less than $3 to over $11.5 in just 3 months. For Turkey, which was almost entirely dependent on fuel imports, This was a critical blow. Oil import costs rose by more than $550 million, and total imports in 1974 reached $3.8 billion, exceeding all government forecasts. Despite reducing oil import volumes from 11 to 9.4 million tons, costs continued to rise. Already in 1974, the foreign trade deficit reached minus $719 million, and a year later, almost minus $1.9 billion. Foreign currency reserves were halved from $2 billion to $1 billion. The economy began to suffocate. Fuel became scarce, and production slowed down. The country was on the verge of default. The government, on the verge, tried to save the situation by sharply raising fuel prices by 68%, and in some places, even 80%, created a stabilization fund and attracted IMF loans. However, these measures were only temporary. By the end of the decade, Turkey was experiencing inflation of over 60%, and in 1980, it nearly reached 100%. Industrial production decreased by 2.8%. That is, even by 5%. Unemployment exceeded 15%, and by 1982, it reached more than 18%. Lines for bread and fuel appeared in the cities. Factories stopped due to lack of energy. Strikes paralyzed transportation. On September 12, 1980, the army intervened again. General Kenan Evren overthrew the government, declared a state of emergency, and took a paradoxical step. He handed the economy not to military advisors, but to a reformist technocrat who believed in the market, Turgut Özal, the new Minister of Economy. The result, rather than the usual restrictive measures during coups, economic policies were relaxed.
Почалася економічна трансформація.
He devalued the lira, cut government spending, abolished most subsidies, and allowed free price formation. Inflation jumped even higher at the start of the reforms. But this is what created room for stabilization. Tariffs were reduced, technology imports were allowed, special export zones were created, and currency operations were liberalized. And the result was impressive. Exports grew from $3.55 billion in 1980 to $17.36 billion by the late 1980s. The economy grew by about 5% each year. New industries emerged: automobile manufacturing, electronics, and the chemical industry. New opportunities opened the country to investments, but also to inequality and speculation on the currency market. The official exchange rate in 1980 and 1981 was 76.11 lira per $1 respectively, while on the black market in those same years, it was 96.2 and 141.5 lira.
Лір за $1 відповідно.
At that time, a fear of a market without rules became ingrained in the public consciousness. Turkey gradually stopped being mainly a textile producer and began exporting machines, televisions, and construction materials. In the second half of the 1970s, textiles and clothing accounted for about a third of all Turkish exports. By the late 1980s, the balance had shifted. The share of textiles and clothing remained high, at about 37% of exports. But more than half of foreign sales, about 52%, came from metallurgy, chemicals, machinery, and transport equipment. The oil shock of the 1970s destroyed the old economic model. State-run, closed, and controlled. Özal laid the foundation for a new liberal, open, export-oriented model. This is how the Turkish transformation from a planned economy to a market economy began. After 10 years of trying to catch up with the West, Turkey made a decisive move. On December 31, 1995, the customs union between Turkey and the European Union came into effect, an event that became a true point of no return. For the first time, Turkish goods gained duty-free access to the richest market in the world, with over 370 million consumers. By 2008, the EU had become Turkey's main trading partner. 56.5% of exports and 40.5% of imports were directed specifically to European countries. Exports to Europe increased from 12.5 billion in 1996 to almost 64 billion in 2008, growing fivefold in 12 years. The automotive industry grew especially rapidly. Ford, Renault, Toyota, and Hyundai factories appeared in Turkey. Car production increased from 343.7 thousand in 1997 to 1.15 million in 2008, and the export of cars and spare parts reached $22.9 billion. That's 12.6% of total exports. Turkey still remains one of the largest and leading exporters of textiles and clothing in the world, entering the top 5 exporters, and as of 2020, it accounted for about 7% of GDP. After signing the customs union, Turkish companies abandoned the model of cheap fabrics and focused on quality and brands. Today, the country has more than 20,000 textile factories and 52,000 garment enterprises with a turnover of over 50 billion euros. Among the partners are Inditex, H&M, Mango, Zara, and the main markets are Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. The success of the customs union has gone far beyond trade. According to the World Bank, it was this agreement that integrated Turkey into European value chains. Turkish companies stopped being just suppliers. They became part of production networks, manufacturing parts for European factories. According to the estimates of the World Bank research team, if cooperation had been limited to a regular free trade agreement, exports would have been 7% lower. The agricultural sector also benefited from integration. Turkey consistently had a positive balance in agricultural trade with the EU. Exports increased from $1.97 billion in 1995 to $4.16 billion.
$1 у 2010-му.
Turkey became one of the world's top 10 wheat producers, the top 5 for sugar beets, the top 3 for tomatoes, and the top 2 for watermelons and cucumbers. Turkish vegetables, fruits, and spices have become common in European supermarkets. The biggest partner was Germany, with a turnover of $31.5 billion in 2008. Germany was not only buying Turkish goods, Germany also invested over $7 billion in the Turkish economy. Over 4,000 companies in Turkey operated with German capital, and 650,000 Turks went to work in Germany under the 1961 agreement. This was the so-called guest worker agreement, an official contract between Turkey and the Federal Republic of Germany, which allowed German companies to hire Turkish workers legally. Germany lacked labor during the economic boom, and Turkey got the opportunity to reduce unemployment and earn foreign currency. Later, the Turkish diaspora became an economic force in Germany itself. More than 75,000 Turkish businesses in Germany provided jobs for 375,000 people, and had a combined turnover of about 35 billion euros. The customs union with the EU was a breakthrough for Turkish industry, but it also deepened the social divide. New business centers appeared in Istanbul, while in the eastern regions there was unemployment and migration. European standards raised the requirements for exports, but not for politics. The country became wealthier, but did not become closer to Europe in terms of values. On February 19, 2001, Turkey experienced a moment that made it into the textbooks. During a security meeting, President Ahmet Necdet Sezer threw the constitution in the face of Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit. He did it intentionally. Tension had existed between him and the Prime Minister for a long time. The president accused Ecevit's government of corruption, weak control over the banks, and inability to contain chronic inflation. As a result, within a few hours, the stock market crashed. The lira began to plummet, and people started converting their savings into dollars en masse. The economy was sustained by a managed exchange rate regime, high spending, and a budget deficit of 12.5% of GDP. Banks also faced a rise in non-performing loans, from 2.3% in 1997 to about 13% in 2001. And inflation reached 54.5%. Turkey was on the verge of complete collapse. The way out of the crisis was provided by Minister of Economy Kemal Dervish, her former vice president of the World Bank, who headed the Ministry of Economy in 2001. He developed the program Turkish Path to Confidence, which included the independence of the central bank, liquidation of 20 troubled banks, reduction of government spending by 5% of GDP privatization, and a strict monetary policy. The reforms were painful. Interest rates reached 2,000%. Unemployment rose from 6.5 in 2000 to 10.8 in 2004. However, within a few years, Turkey managed to overcome chronic inflation, from 55 in 2000 to 8.5 in 2004. The symbol of this restart was the currency reform. 1 million old lira were exchanged for 1 new lira. Against the backdrop of stabilization, in November 2002, the Justice and Development Party, led by Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, came to power, receiving a full political mandate for reforms. During Erdoğan's premiership between 2002 and 2022, Turkey's GDP grew by 4.7 times, from $201 billion to $958 billion in GDP. For comparison, Ukraine's GDP during the same period also grew by 4.7 times. Poland's only by 2.7 times. Per capita income rose from $3,045 to $12,578, and investments poured into the country, $142.2 billion over 12 years, with a peak of $22 billion in 2007. Construction, industry, and tourism experienced a real boom, 1.5 million jobs. The number of tourists increased from 16 million in 2003 to 35 million in 2013, and tourism revenues reached more than $32 billion. That's almost 3.5% of GDP. GDP grew by 5 to 10% each year, and the unemployment rate decreased from 10.4 to 9.7%. Turkey became a member of the G20, it gained the status of an upper-middle-income country, and its companies started investing abroad. For example, Yildiz Holding acquired the Belgian manufacturer Godiva Chocolate for $850 million in 2008. And later, it merged several international brands into the global conglomerate Plytis, which operates on several continents. At the beginning of the 2010s, everything looked perfect. Stable currency, record exports, investor optimism. Turkey seemed like the new economic tiger of Eurasia. But after 2013, all of this gave way to dependence on short-term speculative capital, which quickly enters and leaves the economy, and political centralization of power. The first signals appeared back in the summer of 2013, the protests in Gezi Park, caused by plans to build over public space and the harsh reaction of the authorities. In 2014, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan became president, marking the transition from a parliamentary to an increasingly personalized model of power. Then came the attempted coup in 2016. The state of emergency and the 2017 constitutional changes concentrated key powers in the hands of the president. Beginning in 2018, a new crisis emerged: currency, debt, and trust, the consequences of which Turkey feels today. That's how the era of the economic miracle ended, not because of the economy, but because of the political transformation of institutions. The independence of the Central Bank of Turkey became a victim of presidential policies. Instead of being an institution meant to curb inflation, the bank turned into an instrument of the administration, and its leaders became temporary agents of political will. The turning point was the currency crisis of 2018. On August 3rd, the dollar was worth 5.09 lira, and just 10 days later, it was 6.75. The national currency lost a third of its value in a week. Banks suspended foreign currency lending, and exchange offices worked until late at night. Today, Turks remember that exchange rate as an unattainable dream. The dollar exceeded 40 at one point, reaching 41.8 lira, and the savings that were enough to buy a refrigerator in 2018 could now only buy a kettle. It was against this backdrop that President Recep Erdoğan declared war on the high-interest lobby, called interest rates a tool of exploitation, and personally intervened in the work of the central bank. His economic logic was that high interest rates cause inflation, while low rates would stimulate investment, strengthen exports, and reduce imports, and a cheap currency would make Turkish goods more competitive. On paper, it looked attractive. It was really like playing with fire. The first to come under fire was Murat Çetinkaya. Appointed in 2016, he acted according to classic monetary logic. At the height of the currency turbulence in 2018, he raised the key interest rate to 24%, which allowed the lira to stabilize from 6.4 to 6 lira per dollar. This decision provided short-term stability, but the president did not like it. External political factors dealt an additional blow to the lira. On August 10, 2018, Donald Trump wrote on Twitter, "I have authorized doubling the tariffs on steel and aluminum for Turkey because they did not release American pastor Andrew Brunson." One tweet, and the lira crashed by another 20% in just a few days. The conflict arose because of the arrest of an American pastor on charges of ties to Fethullah's organization. Gülen's movement, which is widely believed to have organized the 2016 coup, and Gülen himself, whom the Turkish authorities consider a terrorist. Trump demanded immediate release. Erdoğan refused. Then, in 2019, Trump threatened to destroy the Turkish economy over the operation against the Kurds in Syria. And today, he already calls Erdoğan a friend. But the country is still recovering from that tweet. Erdoğan blamed the crisis on a shadowy international interest rate lobby that is allegedly running a campaign against the Turkish economy. His speeches began to include conspiracy theories about economic terrorism and currency attacks. But the real battle unfolded within the country, between the president and the central bank. When Çetinkaya refused to comply with the demand to cut the rate by 300 basis points in June 2019, Erdoğan dismissed him early. His successor, Murat Uysal, took over the bank on July 6, 2019. Just a few weeks after his appointment, he lowered the rate from 24 to 19.75%, and by May 2020 to 8.25%, the lowest level since 2016. Such a policy was aimed at stimulating lending, but it led to rising inflation. When inflation exceeded 11% in September 2020, Uysal tried to correct it by raising the rate to 10.25%. However, on November 7, 2020, he was dismissed amid the lira's decline of more than 30% since the beginning of the year. The new head was Naci Akbal, a former finance minister. During his tenure from November 2020 to March 2021, the Central Bank of Turkey raised the rate to 19%, for which Akbal received market recognition for his attempt to restore the central bank's credibility. However, on March 20, 2021, Erdoğan dismissed him because of the decision to raise the key interest rate to curb inflation, which did not align with the president's political stance, as he traditionally opposes high interest rates. The dismissal once again affected the financial market. The lira plummeted by more than 10% in the first hours after the announcement. Erdoğan replaced him with the completely loyal Sahap Kavcıoğlu, a former member of parliament from the ruling Justice and Development Party and a columnist for the pro-government newspaper Yeni Şafak. Then the government came up with a brilliant solution. A new program was launched: deposits protected from exchange rate fluctuations. The essence of it was that if the lira depreciated faster than the interest people earned on their deposits, the state would cover the difference from the budget. In other words, citizens did not lose money due to the currency's decline. At first, the idea worked. The lira sharply strengthened to 10.7 per dollar, an increase of 35% in 5 days, and stabilized at around 13 to 14 lira per dollar in January to March of 2022. However, by the end of 2022, budget payments for this instrument had reached over 91.5 billion Turkish lira. That's about $5 billion. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the program cost about 0.6% of GDP in 2022. At the same time, the money supply increased by more than 40% over 8 months. In 2022, inflation reached 85.51% already. In 2022, the highest level in 85.5%. 85.51% in October 2022. The highest level. In June 2023, after being re-elected for a third presidential term, Recep Erdoğan appointed Hafize Erkan, a former top manager at Goldman Sachs and First Republic Bank, as the head of the Central Bank of Turkey. She immediately got to work. They saved the lira using the old proven standard method, a sharp increase in interest rates. Within a year, the key policy rate was raised from 8.5 in June 2023 to 50 on March 21, 2024. The lira exchange rate really settled in the range of 30 to 32 lira per dollar in January to June 2024. Inflation, which had already peaked in October 2022, approached 65 by the end of 2023. On February 2, 2024, Erkan resigned, citing, I quote, an attack on her reputation. After that, Fatih Karahan, her former deputy, took her place. Under his leadership, the rate remained at a record high of 50%, and inflation gradually decreased to 47.09 in November 2024. On December 26, 2024, the Central Bank of Turkey began an easing cycle, reducing the rate to 37 at the beginning of 2026. After that, the lira exchange rate hit record lows, exceeding 35 lira per dollar at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. And at the beginning of 2026, it was 43 lira per dollar. The shift to orthodox policies was positively noted by international institutions and rating agencies. In particular, Fitch. In 2024, Fitch upgraded Turkey's rating from the first level to B, and later to BB. And at the beginning of 2026, the agency changed the outlook to positive, confirming the BB rating as a sign of moderate economic improvement. Yes, over the past 6 years, the country has had 6 different heads of the central bank. For comparison, in Ukraine during the same period, there have been only 3 heads of the NBU. In developed economies, things are much more stable. Jerome Powell has headed the U.S. Federal Reserve System since 2018, and Christine Lagarde has led the European Central Bank since 2019. Central bank independence is not a whim, but the basis of a stable economy. After 2 decades of economic experiments and unregulated growth, Turkey is entering a phase of institutional rather than financial crisis. Despite attempts at de-dollarization, trust in the lira remains low. As of September 24, 2024, the share of foreign currency deposits was 46.5%. Businesses, especially small ones, are suffocating from interest rates of 60 to 70% per year, and the financial system is operating in survival mode. The government is trying to keep everything under control, destroying competition and the independence of the regulator. Instability affects not only the market, but also has a tangible impact on life. Inflation at 58.5% eats up any income growth. This stimulates emigration. In 2023, more than 714,000 people left Turkey, 40% of whom were young people aged 20 to 34. Institutional failures became especially noticeable after the February 6, 2023 earthquake with a magnitude of 7.8, which claimed more than 53,000 lives and destroyed over 500,000 buildings. The tragedy was exacerbated by systemic violations. Regulations that require high standards for design and control were often ignored. Building supervision is selective, and the 2018 construction amnesty legalized over 3 million structures without full safety inspections, adding 16.5 billion lira to the budget. Corruption in Turkey has become part of the governance model. According to the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, the country dropped from 45 points in 2013 to 31 in 2025. 124th place in the world, ahead of Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, but still below Niger and Mongolia. For comparison, Ukraine rose from 26 to 36 points during the same period. At the same time, the rule of law and freedom of speech also deteriorated. According to the World Justice Project Index, Turkey has only 0.41 points out of 1 and ranks 118th in the world. After the 2016 coup attempt, which the authorities linked to Fethullah Gulen, an Islamic preacher and former ally of Erdoğan, with whom he broke off relations. After the conflict over influence over the courts, police, and state apparatus, the authorities declared a state of emergency and carried out a large-scale purge of state institutions and the media. More than 160 publications were closed, hundreds of journalists were arrested, and Wikipedia was blocked for 3 years. Turkey consistently ranks among the top 5 countries for the number of imprisoned journalists, and in 2025, its press freedom is ranked 159th out of 180 countries worldwide. The 2017 constitutional reform established a super-presidential system. The president gained the right to single-handedly appoint the government, judges, and declare a state of emergency, while the parliament lost its oversight functions. According to the Freedom in the World Index, Turkey has only 33 out of 100 points and is classified as not free. Authoritarian centralization of power is accompanied by increasing economic vulnerability. According to the Democracy Index by the Economist Intelligence Unit, the country has only 4.26 out of 10 points and belongs to the group of hybrid regimes. According to the worldwide governance indicators, government effectiveness decreased from 65.9 in 2013 to 41.5 in 2023. In such an atmosphere, capital flees the country. Lack of freedom turns into risk. Risk turns into distrust, and distrust results in minus $12 billion in investments over 15 years. The volume of foreign direct investment decreased from $22 billion in 2007 to $10 billion in 2023. That is, investors avoid unpredictability. Where freedom is limited, the rules can change. Courts do not guarantee protection, and the state is stronger than the contract. Most often, capital simply stays away. The Turkish experience demonstrates an obvious pattern. Weak institutions inevitably drag the economy down. When regulators depend on political will, investors avoid the country. When government permits and contracts go to insiders, competition is destroyed and productivity is undermined. All of this creates a vicious cycle of institutional weakness. This is the greatest threat to Turkey. Turkey has gone through a difficult journey from Ataturk's modernized state to a country with deep economic and political contradictions. Despite its strategic location and potential, the country has found itself trapped by its own governance failures. Instead of stable development, Turkey has become a hostage to populism, centralization of power, and the undermining of institutional independence. The substitution of professional economic management with political decisions has led to a loss of trust in the institution, investors, currency devaluation, and the degradation of democratic standards. The economic successes of past decades, built on market reforms and international integration, were gradually destroyed. Instead of supporting the independence of the central bank, the government turned it into an instrument of presidential will, which destroyed the stability of the monetary system. Devaluation of the lira, inflationary shocks, and capital flight became the immediate consequences of this policy. The Turkish example shows how ignoring economic laws combined with authoritarian tendencies leads to systemic crises. The political transformation of the state proved to be no less dangerous. The dismantling of the system of checks and balances, restrictions on freedom of speech, and the media destroyed the public's trust in the authorities. Corruption, selective justice, and the lack of accountability among officials made the country vulnerable. For Ukraine, the Turkish path is not just a historical example, but a serious warning. A successful economy is impossible without a strong democracy, the rule of law, and independent institutions. Only where the state does not replace the market, and where politics and the economy are separate, is long-term growth and citizens' trust possible. Turkey has potential, but so far it has no prospects, and it is this difference that is the main lesson Ukraine should remember. Write in the comments what you think. Will Erdoğan be able to keep the economy afloat through political power rather than institutional reforms? This video was made possible by Atlas Network support. The opinions of the authors of this video do not necessarily reflect those of Atlas Network.